Keep going to the places where you know the grace is. And keep knocking, because the time will come. In His time, not ours. We can't manufacture it. We can't make the grace happen. But we can make ourselves available to it when the grace is there. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to talk this evening about and I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks thinking about this topic. Spent time asking God to open my eyes, to help me to see things. Sometimes as I study, I feel like there's knots that are there that I'm trying to unknot. There's something I'm trying to crack, and I don't understand. I feel like I'm looking at something, but I don't have the eyes to see. And I've just been praying that God would give me the insights that He'd have me to have. I want to talk about despair. And I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about this idea of those that are in despair. Maybe you found yourself in a situation where it feels like you're in a long, dark tunnel. It feels like there's, the light at the end of the tunnel just isn't there. And I want to talk about a woman who had every cause for despair, the desperate, despairing woman here, and especially in light of the culture that she was surrounded by. And some lessons that we can learn from this. The story of the woman with the issue of blood. And as I was studying this, something I'd never noticed before, and I want to dig into this as we get further along, is how closely intertwined this story is with the narrative that surrounds it. And some of the commentators that I read have this idea that this is an interruption of the narrative. This is an insertion in the story. And the more that I've read it, the more I've studied it, I'm like, no, it's not. This is so closely interwoven with what's happening inside. And as I was studying, I came across something, and I was incredibly moved by it. This link between the woman with the issue of blood who suffered for 12 years with this, and the daughter that Jesus is on His way to heal that's 12 years old. And this link that's there. So I'd like you to think about that. What is going on with these two stories? How are they linked? And as one writer that I read put it, in one home, a little girl was born. A family welcomes a little baby girl. In another part of that same area, that same year, a woman began to bleed. And for these 12 years, these two lives are in parallel. This little girl who's growing up in this family that loves her, and this woman who's outcast and unclean and seeking for answers in a place of despair. What do we do when we find ourselves in this place of despair as the days pass and the years pass and we don't have answers and the door doesn't open? Nobody comes, no matter how much we knock. How do we respond? What do we do? What can we learn from this woman? I'd like to read the passage in Mark chapter 5, I believe, beginning in verse 25. And a certain woman, which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse, when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, and touched His garment. For she said, If I may but touch His clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in Himself that virtue had gone out of Him, turned Him about in the press, and said, Who touched my clothes? And his disciples said unto him, Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? And he looked around about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him, and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. So here we have this woman that is, inserting herself into this situation. And as I mentioned, this is a passage that a lot of commentators look at as a parenthetical passage, but I'd like to zoom out a little bit and look at the greater context of this passage and what's happening. What story is God telling us through these acts of Jesus? What is he wanting us to understand? And this story, if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, and this story is told in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, and it's told in pretty much the same place. And if you study the Synoptics, you know there's kind of a general chronological flow, but harmonizing can be kind of difficult because the same story is told in one place, and then another time it's told at a slightly different place within the Gospel chronology. They don't follow a strict chronological order the way we might today. But this story is always intertwined with the story of the healing of the raising from the dead of Jairus' daughter. In Mark and Luke, it immediately follows the cleansing of the Gadarene demoniac, and that miracle follows the calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee. And so in Mark and Luke, we have this tetrad of stories. Matthew also has them in the same order, except the healing of the paralytic man is there in between his return from healing the Gadarene demoniac and the coming of Jairus asking him to heal his daughter. So the link isn't quite as strong as in the Mark and Luke accounts, but we have this tetrad of stories that demonstrate Jesus' authority over the natural world, over the supernatural world, over sickness, and ultimately over death itself. And this common theme that runs through these stories is this idea of desperation. It's four situations where people are at the end of their rope, they're at the end of hope, they're desperate, they don't know what to do, and they turn to Jesus Christ. We have the disciples in the boat. The boat's filling with water, the storm is raging. Jesus is there, he's sleeping in the boat. The disciples are terrified, they wake him up, they say, Don't you realize what's going on? The boat's going to sink. And Jesus is like, why are you worried? I'm here, I'm on the boat's not going to sink. And he calms the storm, and the disciples are like, wow, what kind of man is this? Like, who is this that even the winds listen to him? He gets to the other side, and this story is always fascinating to me because this is seems like almost like a wasted trip, right? Because he goes all the way over to the other side, he gets off the boat, he meets this demoniac man, he wrecks the local economy, and they ask him to leave, and he gets back on the boat and he goes by. That's literally all he does on the other side. And so he meets this man. I got ahead of myself a little bit. This demon-possessed man. And what's interesting about him, he hasn't always been this way. How do we know he hasn't always been this way? Because at the end, Jesus tells him, go back and tell your friends and family what God's done for you. Clearly, he had a family to go back to. He had people that he had to leave because he lost his mind because of the demonic possession. We don't know his story. We don't know how he came to this state. What we do know is he's desperate and at the end of the road and he can't help himself. They've tried to restrain him. They've chained him up. It says he plucked the chains apart. And I get this picture in that. I don't know if it's real or not. But of this guy just kind of pulling the chains apart, link by link. There's nobody can contain him. He's there in the caves and he's screaming. He's cutting himself with the rocks. He's completely out of control. And Jesus shows up, this desperate situation, and demonstrates his power over the supernatural world. And this man is clothed and in his right mind. And the villagers are terrified. Like, who is this man? What is he doing? The Gadarene demoniac begs Jesus, let me come with you. I want to come with you. And Jesus says, no, you go home and tell your family about what God has done for you. And then he gets on the boat. He goes back across. He's there in the synagogue. He's teaching the crowds. The crowds are gathered around him thick. You get this picture of the disciples kind of acting as bodyguards or bouncers, trying to hold the crowds back that are just swarming him. And in the middle of all this comes this man, this important ruler of the synagogue. Everybody in the area probably has an idea of who he is. And in modern times, I can imagine it as this crowd that's gathered, and then the crowd parts, as this obviously important man. I picture him in modern terms, in a fancy business suit. And he's there, and he comes to Jesus, and he gets down on his hands and knees in front of Jesus, and he says, "You've got to come to my house. You've got to come to my house. My daughter's sick. She's dying. We're going to lose her. We don't know what else to do. You've got to come." And Jesus says, all right, I'll come. And so in the middle of this teaching, this ruler of the synagogue feels free to interrupt Jesus and say, "Hey, I need you. You've got to come." He begs him, but he feels like he's got this status. He's able to do that. And so Jesus and his entourage comes, and the crowds are gathering around him. And then at this moment, in the middle of one man's desperate story, trying to get help for his 12-year-old daughter, that woman, that 12 years old, had started bleeding, enters the scene. Now, what do we know about her? And we kind of have a tick down the list. Mark and Luke give us this. A certain woman which had an issue of blood. There was actually a term for that in their culture. The term was zava. It's a term for someone who had an unnatural flow of blood. And as a result, this woman is unclean. The clothes she wears, the food she cooks, the chair she sits on, the bed she lies on, everything is unclean about her. And it's transmittable. So if she sits on a chair, the chair is unclean. But then if you sit on the chair, then you're unclean. You can't eat together with her. You can't, you're not allowed to touch her. If you touch her, you're going to be unclean. You're going to have to go take a bath, and you'll be unclean until the evening. And you're really not supposed to do these things willfully. It's like this thing. And part of the thing is the blood flow has to stop for a full week before she's considered not unclean. Now, we don't know for sure exactly how this worked, but I can imagine there were some times where she thought maybe she was cured. And she starts to count the days. And then, oh no, here it is again. She suffered, the Bible says, many things from many doctors. So here's a woman, we've already established she's desperate. Why is she so desperate? Well, because she has, as I said, she suffered many things. She's gone to all kinds of treatments. And what's fascinating is, and I can get you the sources for these, because you read, you can go on the internet and you can look for things, and you find all kinds of wild stuff, much of which is not true. And so I like to try to find actual records and documents that, because I'll read even a Bible commentary and it says, back in this day they did what? And I'm like, says who? Because I can write a book that says all kinds of stuff too. We don't know, is that true, or where can we find this? So I was able to look because I found a couple people who said this is some of the treatments. And I said, that sounds wild. I'd like to know if that's true. And I was able to find in the Talmud a collection of the treatments for someone who's a Zaba. Take a mixture of alum and saffron and Alexandrian gum. And if you don't know what Alexandrian gum is, Google doesn't either, okay? So I tried to figure out what Alexandrian gum was. And I couldn't figure it out. I found about Arabic gum, and I was like, I don't know if that's the same thing or not. But some type of mixture, and mix that in wine and drink it. And if that doesn't work, take 3 vessels of Persian onions. I don't know what makes Persian onions special, but Persian onions, and boil them in wine and have her drink that. And tell her, stop bleeding. That's an important part of a lot of these instructions. It says, do this and this and this, and then tell her, stop bleeding. And then I really like this one. Give her a cup of wine, have her sit at a crossroads with a cup of wine in her hand, and have someone come up behind her and scare her. That's what it says. It's like the hiccups, right? And tell her, stop bleeding. And then, maybe that will work. And if that doesn't work, take 60 barrel seals. probably made from like pine tar or something like that, some type of pitch. Soak them, turn them into a paste, and smear this paste all over her. Because if it will stop a barrel, it will probably stop her. I guess that's the logic. I don't know. But then, of course, you have to tell her, stop bleeding. And if that doesn't work, dig 7 holes in the ground and clip grapevines and burn the grapevines into 7 holes, and then have her go sit in the one hole, and then have her sit in the next hole, and then have her sit in the next hole. And every time she sits in a different hole, you say, stop bleeding. Move to the next one. Stop bleeding. And if that doesn't work, open a barrel of wine and have her drink the whole thing. At the very least, maybe she'll forget how bad things are. And finally, if none of these worked, this was the final remedy. Find a white donkey and go in a white donkey's dung and find a barley grain. And then hold that in your hand for 2 days. If you hold it for 2 days, the discharge will stop for 3 days. But if you hold it for 3 days, it'll stop for good. And this one really works. So those are the treatments that we know about. We don't know about the other treatments they may have had that we don't know about. And so it gives you an idea what a wild world this woman lived in. And it said she had suffered many things and many doctors. I can imagine this woman had tried all the treatments that were available at that time. It says that she suffered many things and no one could help her. Now there's one thing I like to tell people she didn't suffer. She never checked her messages on Facebook and had a friend, hey, how are you doing? I heard you're not doing so well. Oh, I'm doing all right. Yeah, I have this new product you need to try. Thankfully, that never happened. Nobody ever tried to sell her some type of, their remedy. But I'm sure there were people who had their granny's recipe or their aunt's thing that they tried. I'm sure she had no end of people suggesting things she could try. And she apparently tried them all, at least until she ran out of money. Because the Bible says she spent all that she had and didn't get better, but she got worse. We know this woman didn't give up. And you might think that might strike you as a little bit gullible. I don't know if you're like me, but when I was in my, of course this is a very long time ago when glaciers were just beginning to melt and everything, they had just invented the internet. And they had these banners that would flash at the top of the screen. You're the millionth visitor to our site. You want a laptop, whatever. Anybody remember those? Right? Anyway, so I'm like, whatever, 14 or 15, and I'll see this thing. Well, I'd like a new laptop. So I click it, put in your email, all these things. I didn't have a credit card to put in, thankfully. And eventually, after about 7 or 8 of those, I realized the laptops weren't showing up. And I realized, this whole thing is a scam. And I stopped doing it. I didn't keep clicking on it. And I think that it's really easy when we try this and we try that, and this time it sounds good, and this time it's really going to work, and this time it's really easy to get to the point where, like, you know what, this whole thing is a scam. This whole thing, nobody knows the answer. Nobody knows what's wrong with me. Nobody has any clue of how to help me. And you're going to come and tell me, well, this one's different. Well, just like all the others were different, right? But this woman never gives up hope. She keeps trying because it says when she heard of Jesus, she's like, he could probably help me. Isn't that incredible? After 12 years, she's still willing to give this one a shot. Maybe this man can help me. And I find that inspiring. And I think I've mentioned this before, but you can't imagine how much that roller coaster must have been something that would mess with your head over the long haul. Because it wasn't necessarily that this was a continual flow of blood. It may have been something that was there, sometimes it wasn't. It just never got past the 7 days to get you out of unclean status. And some days it may have seemed like something worked, and then it stopped working. But she kept trying. She's like, you know what? I can get to where he is. And if I can get to where he is, I don't have to get his attention. I don't have to break in his, I don't have to do anything except get close enough to touch him, and I'm sure that will heal me. And so now imagine the scene. we have this heartbroken father who's just begged Jesus, you got to come. You got to come to my house. My daughter's dying. She's on the point of death. I know if you can get here, you can heal her. And there's this whole crowd around Jesus. And I picture the biggest, craziest crowd I've ever been part of was when, back in 2004, when George W. Bush was running for president, he came to our little town of Cambridge, Ohio, in southeastern Ohio. It was a rainy day. They had this thing in a ball field. There's probably more people in that ball field had ever been there before. They did tens of thousands of dollars of damage to the ball field with all the people tramping around in that wet mud. And I had a friend that was handicapped, and he was able to get me all up in the handicap section. And I got to shake hands with George W. Bush. And I used to think that was a lot cooler than I think it is now. This crowd, and I mean, this crowd was excited about this guy that was here. He was a president. He's running for re-election, all these things. And I remember being in the middle of this crowd and trying to reach out to shake hands with him and actually standing on one foot while the crowd is just surging around. Everybody's all excited, trying to get close as they can. And only standing on one foot, just being held kind of in midair by this crowd, just surging around me. And that's the picture that I have of this excitement about, here's Jesus and his whole crowd, and here's this woman trying to slip through this crowd, and she's trying to get around this person and under that. And she makes it through until finally she reaches and she touches Jesus, and the minute she does, something happens. And this is something, it's a picture I never had before. I was talking to Yash earlier this week. And this idea of diffusion, or it's almost like this release of static electricity. There's something that happens that Jesus' grace and his power is diffused into this woman. And her need is met. And she immediately feels in herself that the plague is gone and she's healed. And Jesus says, hold on a minute. Who touched me? Everybody's looking at him like, oh, do you see this crowd? What do you mean, who touched you? Hey, do you realize how many people are here? And Jesus says, no, somebody touched me, and I know somebody touched me because I felt something go out of me into them. And I want to know who it was. Well, she was planning on doing a smash and grab, right? She's going to get in there, she's going to touch him, and she's going to get out of there. Get what you want and leave. And Jesus won't have it. And Jesus says, no, somebody here reached out in faith and touched me. And she comes fearing and trembling. Because how does this woman who has no status, who has nobody to go to bat for her, who's spent all she has, who's unclean, who's viewed as being under the judgment of God, how does she have the right to come and touch this holy man? And so she explains, it's been 12 years and everything stops. And there's this conversation that happens. And he says, daughter, go in faith. He's the only woman that's recorded that Jesus calls daughter. And he says, daughter, go in peace. Your faith has saved you. And right at that moment, there comes messengers from the house that say, pack it up, head on home, don't bother Jesus anymore. Your daughter just passed away. And we'll talk about kind of taking the air out of the room at that moment. And Jesus says, no, just have faith. Don't be afraid. It'll be all right. Just have faith. He goes to the house. He walks in the room. The funeral's already started. The funeral party's already there. There's people weeping. There's sadness. And he's like, out. Everybody get out. And they're like, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. And everyone's like, get a load of this guy. Like, we were here when she... Well, and Jesus like, no, you got to go out. And he puts everybody out. And he goes in there with mom and dad and Peter, James, and John and Jesus. And that's all that's there. And Jesus takes her by the hand. He says, little girl, get up. And she sits up and he says, get her something to eat. And she's well and she's healed. So what are we to learn about this? What does this story do for us? How do we take this story and connect it to our life experiences? And it's hard to talk about this story in isolation. It's hard to just talk about the woman with the issue of blood without talking about what's happening, and especially when you consider some of this compare and contrast between the woman, we don't even know her name, and the little girl. And we have this 12 years that link their two lives. It's been her whole life, and this disease has taken this woman's last 12 years. And so there's like this temporal link between the two. And one of the things that we can see in this comparison and contrast is here's someone who's inside. She has a family that cares about her. She has a dad that goes to bat for her. She has her needs met. He's a ruler of the synagogue. There's financial ability there. Over here we have someone who's the outside of the outside. She's spent everything she had. Whatever resources she had were gone. Whatever friends she has, she's not allowed to eat with them. In fact, some of the rabbinic ideas is that it's not even okay for one unclean person to eat with another unclean person because they might get too used to it, this idea, and they might break down some of the idea of separation between clean and unclean. So this is complete isolation. You can't even look and say, hey, I'm unclean, you're unclean, let's go out to lunch. No, even that's not okay. Even that is a bridge too far in this time. Here's someone who spent the last 12 years accepted. She's the apple of her parents' eye. And the text doesn't say that, but we know that's true because her dad was willing to, in public, get down on his hands and knees and beg this itinerant rabbi to come to his house and heal his little girl. So you know that there's something about this daughter that's special to her dad. And here we have someone who is abandoned. Whatever relationships she has, she probably doesn't have anymore because it's really hard to put a relationship on hold for 12 years. And what Jesus does here is he takes the woman who's outside. Every other woman he calls, in the King James at least it reads, he calls her woman. Woman, what have I to do with thee? But this woman, the one who's on the outside, he calls her daughter. And he draws her, and the first thing that's happening here, or maybe we might say the biggest thing that's happening here, is not that Jesus is healing and meeting her physical condition, as important as that is, but he's restoring her to her place in the community. And what's so beautiful about this is it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like he's saying, well, this daughter, she already had everything, so she's accepted, so I guess she just has to die, and we're going to pull this woman in to kind of take her place. After bringing her in, he also goes and reaches the one that's on the inside. This isn't some type of a reversal. It's him showing what his vision is to take care of the people on the inside and draw in the people on the outside. And that's what Jesus does. And it's a beautiful picture of who Christ is in his work. So, what do we do as we look at this story? What are the lessons that we can learn? And I think one of the lessons that stands out to me is this idea of God's grace being diffused into our need, into our weakness. This is a woman who Jesus, until after the work's already done, Jesus never talks to her. There's that one place in the synagogue where Jesus looks into the crowd and he sees a woman and he perceives she has a faith to be healed, and he calls out and says to her, hey, stand up straight. And she does, and she's healed. And of course nobody liked it because he was doing that on Sabbath. But then this is Jesus. He goes to the pool at one time. He walks up to the man and he says, wilt thou be made whole? And he's like, well, yeah, I'd love to. But do you realize the water gets troubled and nobody's there to roll me into the water. What am I supposed to do about it? But Jesus initiates that encounter and says, I want to do something for you. Jesus doesn't do that for this woman. Jesus is kind of in one of the few times in Scripture, he's the passive person in this, and it's her faith, and it's her neediness, it's her desperation that pulls something out of him, and it meets her need. So I think that's something that God's grace is diffused into our desperation, and that's something we can learn from this story. And there's something else, and this is the tough part. This is the bad news. This is the thing that's difficult, and I find this is one of my favorite stories, so I love to talk about it, but it's one of the things that I find frustrating in talking about this story, is 12 years is a really long time. And desperation doesn't guarantee results. This woman, it's not like, here's the woman's desperation, desperate, super desperate, and that's where he got her. She didn't have some kind of peak of desperation on the day that Jesus was in town, and Jesus like, oh, fine, now we can do something. She's finally desperate enough. I don't see any indication that she was any more desperate when she came and touched Jesus' garment than when she was hopping from one hole to the other one with the grapevines. I don't see any more desperation there in one situation than the other. This is a desperate woman. And all those 12 years of searching and seeking and desperation, and she didn't have a single answer. And she was alone in the dark, begging God to do something, to hear her, to move. And so this is something that's really tough to talk about because I'm talking to a group of people that, I didn't count how many people were here, but I'm sure that somewhere in this group of people there's someone who's praying about something, who has something that they want from God, who's desperate about something. And I can't promise you that if you just get desperate enough that today is the day that need's going to be met, that question's going to be answered, that thing's going to come through. I can't tell you that's going to happen. I can't give you a formula. There's something about your desperation that's matched with God's timing and God's working and God's will, and they have to come together, and it's not something we can manufacture, and it's not something that we can make happen. Do you realize that there were people that when Jesus walked the earth, that there were men who buried their 12-year-old daughters in Jerusalem, and Jesus didn't show up at their house and heal those little girls? Do you realize there were probably hemorrhaging women that Jesus never passed through their town, and they were never healed? And they were probably every bit as desperate as this woman. And this is not something that I'm making up out of faith. Jesus points this out to the people at Nazareth. He says, do you think that in Nazareth, that in Israel, that there was no widows that were starving that Elijah could have been sent to, that God had to send him to some woman in Zarephath, that there was no Israelite widows he could have gone to, but he chose to do this. And so this is, like I said, this is the tough part. This is the part that is hard for us to deal with as we try to follow Christ. So what do we do as we look at this woman and we see what Christ did for her, and we also realize that there was the 12 years of silence and of emptiness and of sorrow as she sought, and the answers didn't come. And so how can we be encouraged? Well, I think the first thing is the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, that we ask and we keep asking. We seek and we keep seeking. We knock and we keep knocking, even if, as one author said, it feels like you're pounding on heaven's doors with bruised knuckles in the dark. When the answer hasn't come, that we continue to go to the place where he is. And that's what this woman did. She didn't get to the point where she's like, he's a prophet. He knows where I live. If he wants to heal me, he can come to my house. He did it to that one centurion guy, right? He said, Lord, I'm not worried thou shouldst come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my son will be healed. He could do that for me. Jesus wouldn't have to stop with this woman in the crowd. Jesus could have been walking on to Jairus' house and been like, oh yeah, there's that woman over there, and just thought it and healed her. He could have done that. But that's not what this woman did, and that's not what this woman expected. She expected to go where she knew he was. And when you're in the times of despair, when you're knocking and you're seeking and you're asking and you're not getting the answers and nothing is happening, you've got to go to the places where you know that he is. There's places where God's told us that his grace is there. There's grace in his word. There's grace in prayer. There's grace that's dispensed to us through the Eucharist, and it's in His time and it's His way. But we know that these are the places where God is that we can go. We don't wait for God to show up or for God to do it. We think, how can I put myself in the place of grace so that His grace can be diffused into our lives? And that's one of the things that I think that we can learn from this woman, is not giving up hope and continuing to throw ourselves on the grace of God as best we know how and go to where He is. And the other thing, and this is to me is the beautiful part, this is the good news. This is what's exciting about it. The 12 years came to an end. And Jesus met her need as she continued to press into trying to seek for an answer. Whoever asks receives. Whoever seeks finds. Whoever knocks, it will be open. Just keep knocking. I don't know where you are. I don't know exactly what your struggles are. I don't know what you're knocking on heaven's door for, what you're asking God for. But my encouragement to you, when you find yourself in those places of despair, in those places where it seems dark, keep going to where He is. Keep going to the places where you know the grace is. And keep knocking, because the time will come. In His time, not ours. We can't manufacture it. We can't make the grace happen. But we can make ourselves available to it when the grace is there. And that's my encouragement to you in this story. Because when Jesus passes by, wouldn't it be a shame for that to be the day that she decided to stay home? Wouldn't that be the day, it's sad if that was the day she decided we wouldn't have her story. We wouldn't know about her. Because that was the day she stayed home. That was the day she decided it's not worth the effort. This is just, I've heard this 1,000 times, that this is the answer. I'm just going to sit this one out. She didn't do it. She showed up in her desperation, and Jesus met her need. So my encouragement to you, wherever you find yourself, if you find yourself in year 1, year 2, year 12, or even longer, and you wonder, how can it be so dark, so long? Does He hear me? Does He know? The fact that Jesus showed up for her and met her need, and that 12th year, and restored her in her body, her community, her life, is the proof that we have that she had never fallen off of God's radar, that God heard her prayers, that God knew where she was, and that God was working in her life in spite of her walking through the darkness. And that's the message that I have for you. It's a message of hope, even though sometimes it's difficult and we're in the dark, that Jesus knows where you are, and Jesus is able to meet your need where you are. But I encourage you, go to the places where you know that He is and find your grace there.